Hey folks, welcome to another important video from A Plain Truth for You. We need to get into the history of vaccines, vaca, cow, and how this whole story's come about, and how long the vaccine has been used by the Jesuits and by those that wish to inoculate us with toxins. It's not just today, it's been going on for hundreds of years. So this is about the vaccine, as you saw in the video opening, that killed 50 million people. Now, was this the Tartarians that were eliminated using this mass vaccine campaign? Right around the exact time frame. Were they targeting just the elderly and the adults, so the children? That's why we have the foundlings and the 250,000 children that were shipped across from the eastern United States in the 1910s, 1920s on the foundling trains, because the parents were all exterminated. I hate to talk about this, but that could be the possibility. So let's get into it. Very few people realize that the worst epidemic ever to hit America, the Spanish influenza in 1918, was after the effect of the massive nationwide vaccine campaign. Please also understand that 1918 was the end of World War I. So here you have millions dying overseas. You have World War I going on. We also have the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Titanic sinking. I mean, all of this is around the exact time frame of this massive nationwide vaccine campaign. So if you check back in history, the 1918 flu period, we'll see that it suddenly struck just after World War I when American soldiers returning home from overseas. How convenient. The strain originated at Fort Riley, Kansas, in viruses in poultry and pigs, which were fort bred for food. The soldiers were then sent to Fort Riley around the world, where they spread the disease. It was a common expression during the war that more soldiers were killed by vaccine shots than by shots from enemy guns. The concoction of poisonous drugs and putrid proteins of which the vaccines were composed caused such widespread disease and death among the soldiers that it was common talk of the day. The more of our men were being killed by medical shots than by enemy gunfire. U.S. Army records show that 7 men dropped dead after being vaccinated. A report from the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, not only verified these deaths, but also stated there had been 63 deaths and 28,585 cases of hepatitis as a direct result of yellow fever vaccination during only 6 months of the war. 28,000, almost 29,000 died 6 months due to vaccination. And that was only one of the 14 of 25 shots given to the recruits. Army records also reveal that after the vaccination became compulsory in the U.S. in 1911, not only did typhoid increase rapidly, but other vaccinal diseases increased at an alarming rate. After America entered the war in 1917, the death rate from typhoid vaccination rose to the highest point in the history of U.S. Army. Yeah, go enlist and serve your country, folks. They're really out to take care of you. The report of the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army shows that during 1917, there were admitted into the Army almost 20,000 men suffering from anti-typhoid inoculation and vaccinia. The Army doctors knew all the cases of disease and death were due to vaccination and were honest enough to admit it in record reports. It is known that vaccines often cause other diseases besides the one for which they are given. Instance, smallpox often causes syphilis, paralysis, leprosy, and cancer. Polio shots, diphtheria toxin, antitoxin, typhoid vaccine, as well as measles, tetanus, and all other shots are often cause various other stages of disease, such as post-vaccinal encephalitis, paralysis, spinal meningitis, blindness, cancer, tuberculosis, arthritis, kidney disease, and heart disease. This is why Dr. Luis Garcia is talking about we have to see what the strain they're using in this latest round of the coronavirus, so we can treat the different issues that are spread off and avenued off into all these different issues and maladies that are designed to mask what the true cause of this is. When doctors had tried to suppress the symptoms of typhoid with a stronger vaccine, it caused a worse form of typhoid. After the war, there was one of the vaccines used in a vain attempt to protect a panic-stricken world from the soldiers returning for World War I. Problem, reaction, solution. The only ones who would ultimately escape the influenza were those who refused the vaccine. Let me read that to you again. The only ones who would ultimately escape the influenza were those who refused the vaccine. All right, so I'll put this in the show notes. This goes on and on. But the 1918 flu was the most devastating disease in history and brought forth a profusion of medical tricks to try and control it. But the administering of poisonous, contaminated vaccines only worsened the weakened condition of the people, and the treatments ended up killing exponentially more people than the flu itself. It is estimated that the 1918 flu epidemic killed around 50 million people throughout the world, or as far away as the vaccinations reached. The truth of matters is that most died from the crude and deadly vaccinations administered by their doctors. This is Eustace Mullins, may he rest in peace. Quote, medical historians have finally come to the reluctant conclusion that the great flu, quote, epidemic of 1918 was solely attributable to the widespread use of vaccines. It was the first war in which vaccination was compulsory for all servicemen. The Boston Herald reported that 47 soldiers had been killed by the vaccination in 1 month. All right, so this is from Reformation.org, and I have it also on my Taboo website. Very, very important article here. Vaccination, Vatican's Medical Inquisition revealed at last. So the immunization, the vaccination, inoculation, where do all these words come from? Well, vaccine comes from the Latin word. What's the word? What does Latin mean? Anybody can tell me what Latin, the derivative of Latin, comes from? What is the Latin word for cow? That's the name that was given to the cowpox that Jenner injected into humans in order to make them immune from smallpox, i.e., they created it. A calf is a young cow or bull. Lymph means poison. For vaccines comes from cows. Medicine man Edward Jenner was the father of modern vaccinations. Jesuit Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823. When were the Tartarians purged? Right around this exact same time period. Edward Jenner, a slick Jesuit, taught the medical world how to use the poisoned needle. He was the first to associate human diseases with that of animals. This idea paved the way for vaccination, which is responsible for the deaths of multiple millions of people. The idea that humans and animals are related and share the same diseases led to the theory of evolution, which is responsible for the spiritual death of multiplied millions of more. Now, what is the coronavirus associated with? Oh, it's the bats and the snakes that got out of the farm, out of the farmer's market there in Wuhan. See how they're associating animals, and now they're calling for the culling of animals that may be spreading, and your pets that may be spreading the man-made coronavirus. So in Gloucestershire, England, Jenner lived. The farmers had a legend or superstition that catching cowpox would act like a charm or amulet to make them immune from catching the human disease of smallpox. Medicine man Jenner took this local legend or old wives' tale and turned it into scientific fact. He did this by first getting scientific credentials at the Fellow of the Royal Society. Next, he wrote a book, and on the title page only, he used the term variola vaccine. This means in medieval Latin, smallpox of the cow, thus associating a human disease with the disease of the cow. There was never such a disease as smallpox of the cow until, quote, Dr. Jenner invented the title of the book. Jenner figured that very few people would actually read the book, but most would just look at the cover and make a mental association between smallpox and cowpox. They knew how mind control worked way back in 1798, folks. This is nothing new under the sun. So the whole terminology and everything, this article makes the analogy that this is like saying that the horse chestnut, a tree, and a chestnut horse are the same thing, or that a beetle, an insect, is the same thing as a beetle, a decomposing rock musician. The only correlation between smallpox and cowpox is that both names end in pox. Heaven and hell both start with the same letter H, but they are vastly different places. This is Jenner inoculating his 18 months old son. He'll die of tuberculosis at 20. Getting the jab, he inoculates an 18-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy dies of TB at 21. So bring in Darwinism. Same time period, folks. This is the 1840s. They're bringing in the Darwinism story, or 1800s. He was another doctor, the grandfather of the ape-man Charles Darwin. Since Jenner claimed that humans and animals shared the same diseases, the next step, tick, 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 was to promulgate the idea that they had common ancestor. So Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the famous author of Zoomania, in a little time, it may occur that christening and vaccination of children may also be performed on the same day. Both christening and vaccinations are inventions of the old serpent, the devil. So this goes back to ancient Egypt, and this is what I found interesting. Her name means dwelling of Horus. This is Isis or Hathor. Remember back then it was androgynous. They could switch between male and female, and so their titles were separated later on in the duality of the world that was created. So male and female, but before that, Isis and Hathor had the same, could be interchanged. So her name, Hathor, is the dwelling of Horus. It was thought that Horus was the son of God, came to rest each evening on her breast before being reborn with the awakening of the dawn. Hathor is the great sky goddess that as a celestial cow gave birth to the universe. She was often represented as a cow or with bovine attributes such as a cow's head, cow's ears, or horns on her headdress. Hathor was the goddess of joy and motherhood and the embodiment of all that is best in women. She was also considered the goddess of music, song, dance, and lighthearted pleasure, but she was essentially a moon goddess. She was considered the protectress of the pregnant women and midwives. Her maid cult center was at Dendera, where she was worshipped along with her husband Horus. Hathor was the supreme goddess of sexual love in Egypt, immediately identified with Aphrodite by the Greeks. Her temple at Dendera was the house of intoxication and enjoyments. Her main attributes were two ritual instruments carried by the priestess, the sistrum, a bronze sacred rattle, and the manat, a necklace, thick with beads and counterpoise, long enough to be grasped in the hand, which was only worn by Hathor, but used by priestesses as a healing instrument. In Greece, she was known as Diana of the Ephesians, and in Rome as Venus. Papal Rome later stole her from the Egyptians and called her the Virgin Mary. During the Dark Ages, Papal Rome had a death grip on Europe. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, war, famine, disease, and death, rode roughshod over the world for 1,000 years. Lack of personal hygiene and sanitation led to the plagues and epidemics to millions of people. All right, so this goes back to the history of the Roman Catholics, how they've been running the show for a very, very long time, creation of our modern mythology of history. And so we're all into revisionist history, and if you get the book by Fomenko, History, Science, or Fiction, the 14 volumes, it'll reset history back to 1200 AD. Jesuit priests made contact with the most powerful medicine men in order to find more potent poison to kill the Reformation. Francis Xavier, 1506 to 1552, was sent to India and Japan. Francis Xavier was sent to India and made contact with a powerful Brahmin priest and medicine man. It was there that the Jesuits learned the Brahmin mode of inoculating to appease the vicious, vengeful demons of smallpox. Going down the list here, he just goes into the whole history of this, which is really fascinating reading. Dr. J. Holwell sent a most detailed account of these religious rites in the College of Physicians in London in 1776. Quote, inoculation is performed by Indostan by a particular tribe of the Brahmins. So they're chronicling how the Jesuits went over, they taught them how to use the poison needle and use the tribe's healing methods to inoculate and use the vaccine to inoculate the poison into people all over the world. And this is just chronicling all over the world. Here's Dr. Louis Sacco, the Jenner of Italy. It was not unusual, Marshall wrote, to see in the mornings of the public inoculation at a hospital a procession of men, women, and children conducted through the streets by priests carrying a cross that are coming to be inoculated. There's the Jenner of Spain. There's Louis Pasteur, the Jenner of France. Louis Pasteur was the Jenner of France. He conducted, look at him in his priestly robes, he conducted all kinds of ghoulish experiments on animals in order to prove his germ theory of disease. His ancestors were Huguenots who were forced to embrace the Romanism by the Inquisition. So the pasteurization of milk is named after Pasteur. This process involves heating milk until all the nutrients are boiled away. We are not allowed to drink real milk, but the medical inquisitions lets us be vaccinated with diseased calf limp or poison. So I wanted to bring your attention here, just on a sidebar, bovine leukemia virus discovered in human blood. This is 2019 infectious diseases. What Dr. Garcia, when I took his level 1, he talked about getting off milk and cheese and all dairy products because 80 to 90% of milk is infected with bovine leukemia virus. It's a widespread cattle globally and is presented in marketed beef and dairy products. Human infection with BLV has been reported in breast and lung cancer tissues and was significantly associated with breast cancer in 3 case-controlled studies. I'll put this in the show notes, but you can read about how milk is causing cancer. How many people are talking about bovine leukemia? So this is another thing why we need to get off the dairy products and whatnot and get over to almond milk and coconut milk and some of these other options we have. All right, so just finishing up the history of the medicine man. So this is really important that we understand the origins of the vaccine coming from the smallpox cow, being introduced into humans, apples and oranges, but they made it into an apple orange. So if you read down here, Jenner's history, vaccinating his son, inoculates James Phillips, and he sends this paper. You can see how this all began to come about. But what I want to show you down here, in 1717, Jesuits introduced inoculation from India using Lady Montagu as a smokescreen. She wasn't even a doctor. Women doctors did not appear until over 100 years later. Also, just on a small sidebar again, they also introduced all of the telescopes they took to India and China back in the 1500s, middle 1500s, to start telling the story and laying the groundwork for the whole round ball, spinning ball theory that was introduced by Newton and Copernicus and all those to start the lie. But if you look at the history of telescopes and history of observatories around the world, you'll see they're all introduced by the Jesuits and the Vatican. So 1870, the outbreak of smallpox over Europe. 1900, the Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan syndicate buys Encyclopedia Britannica, and all derogatory references to vaccinations are removed. Controlling the message. This is another one I've gotten into several videos, the Andrew Flexner Report, whose brother worked as president of Rockefeller Industries. Flexner Report issued, which calls for the elimination over half the medical schools in the United States. These are homeopathic schools. This was also magnetricity schools teaching magnetic healing. And they came out with this report, and they called magnetic healing quackery, and they banned the AMA from doing it and closed down medical schools across the country where they're teaching people how to heal. 1911, vaccinations is made mandatory in the U.S. Armed Forces. 1917, U.S. soldiers vaccinated, went over that. 1918, 675,000 Americans and 25 million die from vaccinations in the worst epidemic in history. The medical inquisition carves it up by calling it the, quote, Spanish flu. 1976, the great swine flu hoax. President Ford is vaccinated before a TV audience. More than 500 people receiving flu vaccinations become paralyzed with Guillain-Barré syndrome. We have magnetic placements for lifting that out of people as well. 1991, Gulf War begins. Thousands of coalition soldiers receive vaccinations with the deadly anthrax germ. 2002, Gulf War II, the sequel, leads to the vaccination of the entire U.S. population. So you can see how long this has all been going on. This is a great article, website. I'll put this in the show notes. You know, and just to bring it home, the United States a little further, this is from, I believe, 1923, the Squamish Tribal Historic Preservation Office. This was the agreement with Canada, the United States, and the creation of the Squamish tribe. The United States established the General Agency for the District of the Puget Sound, taking the Native Americans and putting them into their controlled school systems. But I want to bring your attention to the last part here. Let me move this down if I can. The blacksmith, carpenter, farmer, the like term of 20 years to instruct the Indian in their respective occupations. and the United States finally agree to employ a physician to reside at the said central agency who shall furnish medicine and advice to their sick and shall vaccinate them. And here's the Wikipedia article about the Canadian government creating the Squamish. This was in July 23rd, 1923, in a political amalgamation, which included mass vaccinations of those that they put on the reservations. And I just wanted to hit up on the Jesuit oath again. This is the fourth vow they take. We have Trump is a Jesuit, went to Jesuit school out here in California. The governor, previous governor, Jerry Moonbeam Brown, was a Jesuit minister. Current governor, Gavin Newsom, went to Santa Clara, the main Jesuit school. The head of the UC Regents for overseeing the UC school system is Janet Napolitano, went to Jesuit school. Bill Clinton went to Jesuit school at Georgetown University. Georgetown University was founded 6 months before Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was named Rome, Maryland. The White House is named after Andrew White, the first archbishop that came over on a boat, the Freemason, into Jamestown. Look it up. Revisionist history. But here's the Jesuit oath that says, and it will openly wage war against any heretics, Protestants, liberals, as I'm directed to do so. I will hang, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics. I'll rip up their stomachs and wombs of their women and crush their infants. This is the vow this religion takes, folks. I'll bash their heads against the wall in order to annihilate them forever, their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poison cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, and the poison needle, regardless of the honor of rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons, whatever may be their condition of life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed to do so by any agent of the Pope or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith, the Society of Jesus. All right, so wrapping it up, bringing it home, ending this so you know. So now they got the lockdown, 11 million quarantine. I want to give a big shout out to David Dees. His artistic work is beyond the pale. He's one of the only true activist artists around. We don't hear activist music anymore, except for Michael Fronte, but he's not coming out with much anymore. But David Dees is doing what, as my grandfather used to say, a yeoman's job. And this is just a great piece of artwork. The coronavirus listed in medical encyclopedia is the common cold. Bill Gates funded the vaccines. He has a Netflix series on the next pandemic. He just released the new one coming out on Netflix. The airport thermal scanners detect the flu temperature, so they're all ready to go for mass quarantine and mass inoculation. And you've heard me say before, and I'll say it again, it's my child, my choice. No one's putting anything in my child unless I agree or family agrees. And we have to take that, we have to take that mantra, folks, because if we don't decide for ourselves what we're the author or authority, they're just going to run us over. Quote, no single person, including the President of the United States, should ever be given the power, I don't give him my power, to make a medical decision for potentially millions of Americans. What America? South America? Central America? Canada? See how they obfuscate the terminology? Freedom over one's physical person is the most basic freedom of all, and all people in a free society should be sovereign over their own bodies. When we give government the power to make medical decisions for us, we in essence accept that the state owns our bodies. Unless we speak up, they will do what they're going to do. That's why they have hearings in court. You must speak your truth. That's why it's so critical for all you awakening truthers to speak out. Whether you may lose your job, whether you may lose your family, whether you may lose your friends. There's time short to be speaking before they silence us all. So it's incumbent on doing it very soon, very quickly, and now. Thank you all. Appreciate all you're doing and listening and be the change we have to see, because this is going to keep growing, this coronavirus, but we're going to have some answers, but we need to educate and share with others. Thanks for listening. Peace and love one another always.
It is in the individual memory of a great many of us, but it's not in our collective memory. That for me is the greatest mystery, how we could have forgotten anything so horrendous, so massively horrendous as this epidemic, which killed so many of us, killed us so fast, and our reaction was to forget it.
Why? Why wasn't that part of our memory or of our history? And I think it's probably because it was so awful while it was happening, so frightening, that people just got rid of the memory, but it always lingers there as a kind of an uneasiness. If it happened once before, what's to say it's not going to happen again? The more we find out about influenza virus, the more real that fear becomes.
The fall of 1918 was a time of horror, a time to forget. But some would always remember.
I remember my mother putting a white sheet, a white piece of cloth over his face, and they closed the casket.